All right, let's just jump right in. We've all been feeling it, right? That pinch at the grocery store, at the gas pump, prices going up. But what if the story we're always told about why this is happening, what if that story's missing some really crucial pieces of the puzzle?
And this right here, this is the classic textbook explanation. Milton Friedman's famous line. It's a really powerful idea that has shaped economic policy for decades, right? The basic gist is that inflation is at its core a money problem. Just too much money floating around in the system.
But what if it's just not that simple? The last few years have really thrown a wrench into that neat little story. It's forcing a lot of people to ask, is there another way to think about this? Another reason our money just doesn't seem to go as far as it used to.
Okay, so before we get into the new stuff, let's do a quick refresher on the theory most of us probably learned in school. You know, the one that you always hear about in the news.
So this is called demand-pull inflation. And the logic, on the surface, seems pretty straightforward. The idea is that the economy is just overheating. We're all spending too much, and that's pulling prices up. So the central bank's job? Well, they're supposed to step in and hit the brakes, basically by raising interest rates to make it more expensive for all of us to borrow and spend money.
And the main justification for this hitting the brakes policy, it comes down to this foundational and kind of grim idea in economics called the Phillips curve. For decades, it told policymakers this simple but painful story. There's a trade-off. If you want to get inflation down, you have to accept that unemployment is going to go up. A certain number of people, unfortunately, have to lose their jobs to cool things down.
But here's where things get really interesting. In the aftermath of the pandemic, it's like this old map just stopped working. It started leading us completely astray because the actual data, well, the data started telling a very, very different story.
Now, to be fair, economists have been pointing out for a while that this relationship was getting weaker, ever since the 70s. But the data from the last couple of years, it's not just a weak relationship, it's a direct, powerful challenge to the whole idea.
And just look at this. This chart shows the puzzle perfectly. Unemployment fell to these historic lows, and at the same time, inflation also fell, and fell a lot. This is the exact opposite of what the classic Phillips curve says should happen. We got inflation down without the huge spike in job losses everyone was expecting.
And that's not the only thing that didn't quite add up. Check out this number, 72%. That was the average markup for U.S. firms in 2021, the highest since the 1950s. Now, if the story is just about too much demand across the whole economy, how do you explain record-breaking corporate profits? It kind of suggests there's something else going on, doesn't it? Something at the level of the firms themselves.
So, okay, the old theory is clearly struggling to explain the facts on the ground. Let's put on our detective hats and investigate an alternative. What if we start looking at inflation not just as some technical, mechanical problem, but as a social one?
This is what's known as the conflict theory of inflation. And at its core, it's pretty simple. It says inflation is basically a fight over the economic pie. Who gets what slice? It's a tug-of-war between different groups in the economy over their share of the income.
So let's break down how this conflict actually works. On one side, you've got workers. They're trying to protect their real wages, what their paycheck can actually buy after accounting for prices. On the other side, you have firms, and they're trying to protect their profit margins. The problem happens when the claims from both sides add up to more than 100% of the pie. When that happens, something's got to give, and that something is the price level. Prices have to go up to resolve the conflict.
Okay, so that's the big picture conflict. But this leads us to a more nitty-gritty question about corporations themselves. How do prices actually get set in the real world, especially when things get chaotic, like during a big supply shock?
This idea is called seller's inflation, and it basically unfolds in 3 stages. First, you get an impulse. Think of a big initial shock to the system, like an energy crisis or a shipping bottleneck. That's stage 1. Then comes stage 2, propagation. This is where firms further down the supply chain see that initial shock and use it as cover. They pass on their own costs, sure, but maybe they also pad their profit margins a little, or a lot. Finally, you get stage 3, conflict. This is when workers, seeing prices for everything go up, start demanding higher wages just to keep their heads above water.
And don't just take my word for it. Listen to this. This is from an actual corporate earnings call. They're basically saying, hey, customers get it. There are supply chain issues, so we've had little pushback on raising prices. Widespread chaos essentially gave firms this implicit permission slip to raise prices because they knew everyone else was doing it and customers would probably just accept it.
Okay, so let's put it all together. Let's apply this new way of thinking to what we've just been through.
Instead of looking for one single culprit, like too much demand, we start to see something different. We see a cascade of factors, all linked together.
So you have the supply chain bottlenecks, right? Shipping, microchips, all that stuff. That was an initial shock. Then you had the huge energy price spikes. Another shock. Then you had firms and markets with little competition using that chaos to pump up their profit margins. And on top of all that, you had specific pressures in places like housing and healthcare. It wasn't one giant forest fire. It was a bunch of smaller, interconnected spot fires. And you don't put out spot fires by just flooding the whole forest. You need to target them.
And this is the really crucial takeaway. If the diagnosis of the problem is different, then the medicine has to be different too, right? If the problem isn't just too much demand, then the solution can't be just jacking up interest rates. This more nuanced view opens up a whole new toolkit of policies, things that are much more targeted and don't rely on that one blunt instrument that can cause so much pain for so many people.
And what this all really does is it changes the conversation. It helps us move away from asking this very narrow technical question, what's the right interest rate, and toward asking a much bigger, more fundamental question about the kind of economy we actually want to build. So ultimately, if prices aren't just some number that pops out of a machine, but are actually the result of our choices and our economic structure, then what choices are we going to make? That's the real question this perspective leaves us with. It's not just about how we react to rising prices, but about how we can build a more stable, a more equitable, and a more resilient economy from the ground up.